You know, the best part about having wheat like this field here, Brian, is we don't have to worry about corn rootworms. They're a terrible problem in corn, especially if you're in continuous corn.
You know, though, we actually still do have to worry about corn rootworms. So we're going to start from the end and work our way back. Last summer, one of the steps you could have taken to reduce your rootworm issues this year was to kill any adult corn rootworm beetles that showed up. And you know, there are rootworm beetles now that will lay eggs in wheat fields. They'll lay eggs in soybean fields. And so if you see a whole bunch of corn rootworm beetles out in your wheat field or soybean field, you might just want to spray if you're going to be raising corn next year.
Well, okay, you talk about spraying at the end of the season. I'm worried about...
No, we're going to go from back to the beginning, all right?
Boy.
So now we'll take it a little bit earlier in the season. So if you're in soybeans and you have volunteer corn, that's a nice host for those rootworms. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to spray my volunteer corn herbicide when I'm going to go out the first trip on Roundup. I'm going to save it for the second trip. Well, that's fine. You can do that. But number one, you lost yield. And number two, you just provided a host for rootworms, and they only need a host for about 1 month. And that's about how long you wait between spraying the first time in Roundup and the second time. So we always advise you to spray your volunteer corn first rather than last to prevent the rootworm problem. All right, Darren, now we can go to the beginning.
Can we go back to planting time?
Yeah, now we can go back to the beginning.
Okay. Well, when you think about it, planting time, and those things are important too, Brian. I agree with you 100%. They're very important. I think the most important thing, though, in your corn is to get out there at planting time and do something right, because there's really no rescue treatment post-emerge for corn rootworms because they're going to be deep underneath the soil. So what we're looking at planting time is we need to either make a decision of I'm going to ban some insecticide on top of the ground, or I'm going to drop some in the furrow, like in a T-band where I have some on top of the ground and some in the furrow, or I'm just going to put it all in the furrow. And it really comes down to how your planter is set up and how you can apply corn rootworm insecticide, whether you're going to use a liquid product or a dry.
Yeah, but there are some products that you can only use in furrow. Which method is the best for rootworm control? It doesn't make a lot of difference. I prefer a T-band if I've got a product that could be used that way, but it's not that big a deal. Just using some insecticide is really important. And if you have resistant rootworms, we strongly encourage you to use the full rate rather than a reduced rate. We're using a reduced rate on our farm when we're planting Smart Stacks corn, and I don't have a real big issue with that. But at some point, we're going to see resistance to the Smart Stacks trait as well, or two traits that are in there. And when that happens, then we've got to bump it to a full rate.
Well, I find it interesting, Brent. I just started talking about the insecticide. I said nothing about the traits because I start my program, regardless of if I have Smart Stacks or not, thinking, how am I going to get insecticide on there? I want to have some. Here's why. When you look at how corn rootworms work, if you've got a BT trait, those rootworms have to find those roots and then take a bite out of the roots. And once they take the bite out of the roots, they're going to die. Now, if you have lots of corn rootworms, well, they're going to take a lot of bites out of that plant, and you could still see it fall over in the field. And we've seen that with a number of guys across the upper Midwest where they have corn that falls over and they say, wait a minute, I had a trait there, whether it's one trait or two traits in the plant, and I still fell over. Well, it could be just due to heavy, heavy pressure. The other thing that we are seeing is rootworms that are resistant. Now, the resistant rootworms so far have only been resistant to the single trait BT products. They haven't been resistant to something like Smart Stacks that has two different rootworm BTs in it.
Okay, now one of the things you said there is you for sure want to use insecticide. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that because we have a real good idea in continuous corn if we're going to have a lot of rootworm pressure the next year if you just go out and scout your cornfields in the middle of the summertime. If you're seeing any rootworm beetles at all, you're going to have some pressure next year. If you're seeing no rootworm beetles, you might not have any problem, Darren. I've never seen that before.
I haven't seen that. The other thing is we're talking about beetles here, and they can fly. They can fly several miles.
Yes, but they don't move real far. That's the nice thing about beetles. It's different than aphids or moths or something like that. Beetles don't move very far.
Well, they're going to move hundreds of miles,
right.
But there's nothing saying if we had them in this field that they couldn't end up a mile down the road.
Right.
So you have to keep that in mind. If your neighbors are planting corn, you say, well, I'm not planting corn all that much, or I'm only planting it every other year. Hey, you could still have an issue in your field.
Okay, one last thing. Let's talk about which insecticides are the best. We prefer the dries. They're going to be a little bit better than the liquid, but the liquid is easier to handle. And like with Capture LFR, it is significantly less expensive than the dry products. And some of these dry products are sold out already, like Force in Smart Boxes. You can't even get that if you wanted it.
Use what's available. If you can get Capture LFR and run it right through your liquid starter system, That's an easy way to go for a lot of guys. They're already putting starter on, or they may be interested in putting that system on. It doesn't cost that much money to do, and they have programs to help you pay for the equipment if you want to get started.
Okay, so once again, if you're worried about resistant rootworms on your farm, plant Smart Stacks corn, use insecticide at planting time, and then spray insecticide later in the season when you see adult corn rootworm beetles.
And don't forget to control volunteer corn in your soybean fields. That's a great way for rootworms to make it through your rotation, and they don't have to survive for about a month on the roots. That's all time we have to talk about corn rootworms because we have a tough weed of the week to control. Can you identify this week's weed?